I don't need to introduce Hilaire du Berrier to you. You all know him. You know his reputation, for authenticity, for accuracy of prediction, for understanding many of these very complicated situations. And it's a great satisfaction that we've been able to get him to give us a little time tonight to help straighten out a few more of the problems in our mind. Hilaire du Berrier.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I can't tell you how touched I am by your being here tonight, because certainly no greater dedication hath man than the willingness to come here and sit at this time of night after having listened to speakers all day to hear what I might have to say to you. Believe me, I'm touched. What a shame we can't have a week here. What a shame we can't have a seminar in order to talk about some of the things that I'm going to skim for you to the best of my ability in the half hour or so that I am going to speak to you before we turn this into a conversation between you and me and try to answer some of the questions you may want. Because tonight, as we sit here, why, we are on the crest, we're on the balance of a turning point, and anything may happen, and I can't imagine anything good happening. The 8 weeks have passed. We're pulling our boys out of Cambodia. Can you imagine anything more disgraceful? Since when in the history of nations has a country ever sent an army into a nation to fight, to protect its soldiers, announcing in advance how far it will go and when it will be pulled out? And all the enemy had to do was to withdraw beyond that 21 miles and to wait out the 8 weeks and now come back. It's absolutely shocking. And the question is, how did we get into this business? How many of you people read that series of articles by Mr. Dudman telling about the period of captivity that he and two other correspondents, one from the Christian Science Monitor, and of course here was our correspondent from the Dispatch News Service. I loved that, the surprise lots of people expressed that a correspondent from the Dispatch News Service was so well treated by the Viet Cong. Why, good heavens, would you expect the Nazis to do anything to the German-American Bund? And here this man, didn't you love that when he said that at the end of our captivity we found that we were friends? Why, they were friends before the captivity started. And then he told us, now here was the one significant thing that I'd like to impress on you, because I wonder how many people reflected on this. Without batting an eye, and in all good faith, he reported to you that we did just what the enemy wanted us to when we invaded Cambodia. That was the biggest mistake we ever made, and that was what the enemy wanted us to do. You know, that Oriental enemy is so clever. He is so far ahead of us in the psychology of war that every time they take a prisoner, every time they have a chance to give an interview, why, they will discuss what we have just done, and they will say, that was the biggest mistake you ever made. That's just what we wanted you to do. And that is to give an argument, to provide an argument for people like Senators Mansfield, Kennedy, Javits, Fulbright, to oppose whatever our government does on the argument that that's just what the enemy wants us to. When, as a matter of fact, last night when I was talking to you, I told you a few of the things that the Cambodian ambassador had told me yesterday morning. I had a very interesting talk with him, and from there I went over and talked to the Vietnam ambassador to the United Nations. As I said, these men have no delusions. They know what they're up against. I begged both of them to come up here for a day at the rally. I said, you realize that here is an opportunity for you to go and meet the leading conservatives of America. These are the people who are your friends. You don't have many friends in Washington. Time magazine certainly isn't a friend of yours, with Time magazine bragging about their new correspondent, Mr. T.D. Allman, out in Phnom Penh. Why, Allman is nothing but Senator Fulbright's bird dog. Do you folks remember reading about 3 months ago that Mr. T.D. Allman, accompanied by 2 other correspondents, went for a walk out into the forest in Laos, and after a full day's trek, they discovered a secret American base, and then they broadcast this all over the world in front pages? Well, you say, the next 24 hours later, why then you have Senator Fulbright ranting against Americans having a base in Laos. And what Allman did was get this in print so that Fulbright would have it to quote. And this is what we're up against out there. And here we have men then like going out there like this fellow Dudman coming back and reporting to you that when we invaded Cambodia to save our boys, how shocking that was. Stop and think of that. Here there were 40-some thousand enemy troops just over the border. And it was admitted that we did everything we could to prevent ourselves from having to go in there. That our government sent message after message to Hanoi after the fall of Prince Norodom Sihanouk saying that if you will agree not to spread out and take the rest of the country, we won't invade Cambodia, we will respect your sanctuaries. Look at the amount of arms that we took out of those sanctuaries. Everybody knows what they were planning to do. The plan that was afoot was to await a propitious moment as we pulled out of South Vietnam, and when we got enough men out that we could not put up a stiff fight there in the rear, why then they were going to give us a Dunkirk. They were going to attack us, and that was what they were waiting for, but they were waiting until we had reached the proper point of withdrawal. And how shocking it is that the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army was willing to send a message to the enemy saying, we will leave that catch of yours, that sanctuary, your 40,000 men, your stockpile of material so that you can kill our rear guard if you will just save our faces by not trying to take the rest of the country, because if you don't try to take the rest of the country, then we won't have to come in. We won't look like a bunch of cowards by not coming in. We won't look like we're feeding our boys into a meat grinder. How shocking this is. And this is the sort of a way we have waged this war, and it comes down then to the question of why have we done it? Oh, I wish we could talk to you for a week about this. I have here one of the propaganda publications of the Viet Cong. And this was put out in February, and it's called The Revolt of the U.S. Academe. Here's the academic world, and they go on to tell you, I'll be happy to show this to some of you after our conversation tonight if it interests you. It says that the revolt of our professors started in 1962 when 12 professors wrote their famous letter to Kennedy disapproving of the Vietnam War. And that since then it has grown and grown and grown until the entire academic world has joined it. Well, of course, what you have, this may be more interesting to me than it's been to you, because what I am seeing unfolding before our eyes is an exact parallel of what went on during the Algerian War. Here was a war that could have been won in 6 weeks, 2 months at the most. And we had professors mobilizing their infantry. And these professors would mobilize the students, send the students out into the streets, fighting, demonstrating, stampeding with the workers, with the Communist Party, with the Socialist Party, with all these massed organizations. And then the professors, however, would pull back, and they would stand back off to one side, and with the most guileless look on their faces you ever saw in your life, why they would say to the press and to the government, we're going to have to stop this thing because they're getting out of hand. We're going to have to make concessions to them because there are wrongs that have to be righted, and they are the coming generation. And if we don't stop this, why, we're going to have more demonstrations and violence, and it's going to lead to anarchy. And here are these men doing the talking with the very men who touched it off. And that's what we're having in this country right now. It is strange how parallel this operation is that we're watching unfolding before our eyes over here. And then these professors were touching it off, continued this sort of thing, and now How interesting this is that the propaganda sheet of Hanoi says that it started in 1962 when a small group of professors got together, and of course by now with men like Marcuse and Angela Davis and Galbraith and Reischauer. I always liked what they said about Reischauer over in Japan. They said that his wife was a better American than he was. She's Japanese. And these men, you see, mobilizing their infantry, the students, they're their shock troops, setting them in motion and then denying any responsibility for what has happened. And now one of the latest things that we have, and this, I shouldn't say the latest development, starting development, do you remember that on the 12th of March, 1969, Professor Kissinger announced that 46 of the top professors of the United States were being called into the White House because they wanted the academic world to know that we were utilizing the best minds of our country. My good heavens, because a man has a degree, what is that going to say? Is that any proof, whatever, that he represents one of the best minds of our country? Over in England, they've known for years that the eggheads were the jackasses. These people living in their world of theory, and when you get to that world of theory, how interested I am in that application of the term, the world of theory to the professors. One of the left-wing daily papers in England is The Observer. And they got a woman named Nora Beloff over there. Nora Beloff wrote for a long time in the United States. And she has been the leading exponent over America, or in England, you see, of the theory that America is now on the right track and that they've got the right sort of men running the country. And one of the men that she is pushing is Dr. Henry Kissinger. And so consequently, since she is for him, friendly with him, it's very interesting to take her evaluation of him. She said, here is the great admirer of Bismarck, the man who made it his life's aim to reach a position of power where he could translate theory into reality. And there we have the picture of the professor. Sad story. The man who made it a goal to reach a position where he could translate theory into reality, and now he is at the right hand of President Nixon and probably spends more time with him during the day than Mrs. Nixon does. We're told that he spends approximately 3 hours of every day with the president and is on the telephone with him 15 minutes out of every hour that he is not in his presence. So how about this man? Nora Beloff had a long talk with him, and he told her that he does not see where the communization of Southeast Asia would be any threat to the United States. He has told her that he is less fearful of the violent left in the United States than he is a backlash from an anti-intellectual backlash from the right. Isn't that a beautiful statement? Stop and analyze that. Just turn that over in your minds as though it was a marble that you're holding up and you're looking at it from all sides to see if it's chipped. That he is not afraid of the violent left, but he is afraid of an anti-intellectual backlash from the right. If you want to translate that into proper English, what he is really saying is he is admitting that military defeat is always followed by a revolt at home. Look at World War I. You realize that after World War I, 3 kingdoms, 6 empires, and 21 principalities and duchies disappeared from the face of the world simply because the leaders of these monarchies, these kingdoms, empires, principalities, and duchies led their people into a war that they were not able to win or not intelligent enough to win. Well, now, this can be taken as axiomatic, that military defeat is followed by revolt at home against the government responsible for that defeat. Ladies and gentlemen, you and I aren't children, let's talk sense. Can you imagine a greater revulsion, I don't like to use that word backlash, because actually it is a return swing of the pendulum that it, you see. But the backlash was invented by people who were afraid of facing the consequences that were inevitable if we followed the path that they were pushing us into. And so consequently, they used the word backlash because it makes it sound vicious. And all it is reaction. Can you imagine a more justifiably violent reaction than the reaction of an army coming home from a war that it could have won in 2 months and was prevented from winning? A defeat that was not a defeat forced on us by the enemy, but forced on us by our own leaders at home. And that is why Professor Kissinger is more afraid of an anti-intellectual backlash from the right than he is of the violent left in our country. And I think that's one of the greatest admissions that that man ever made. Interesting thing about that man, he knows nothing about Southeast Asia. He is reported to have made a trip to Hanoi. He has never admitted it. There is reason to believe that he did make that trip to Hanoi in 1967. And the president of Yale has said that he made that trip to Hanoi. He knows really nothing about Southeast Asia, as Nora Beloff said of him, his admirer, that his business is theory and the translation of theory into reality. One of the people I'd like to wish we could get up this meeting, over here in Belmont, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, the capital of conservatism in the United States, lives the ex-Mrs. Kissinger. And I wish we could get her over here to get her to tell us something about the man who is now running this country. Because those who know him say that modesty is not one of his virtues, and that some might go so far as to call it arrogance. And maybe Mrs. Kissinger could tell us something about his judgment. Because who should this man take? Who should this man take on as his authorities on Southeast Asia, but 2 French communists, you see? Now, if you and I, if the people in this room were to suggest that we use a valid authority on Southeast Asia like General Salan, some man like that who had fought out there, General Navarre. General Navarre lost the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and of course that ruined his reputation. But he will tell you that he didn't lose it in Indochina, he lost it in Paris, and then he will add that we're not losing it in Indochina, that we're losing it in Washington. That's another parallel of history. If we were to suggest that a man like that were to be used as the advisor to our government and an emissary to Hanoi, why, do you know that the New York Times and the Washington Post and Time Magazine and Newsweek Magazine, Katharine Graham's publication, poor Katharine is a widow now, her husband bettered his situation by committing suicide, and why, publications like that would just hoot us out of town. And yet, how incredible it is that our country has taken on these 2 men, Obrak and Markovich, and sent them out there to Hanoi as our emissaries to negotiate with that government, to tell them what our terms are, and to come back and tell us what they have been able to wring out of Hanoi. You ever stop and think about that? That Obrak's real name really is Samuel. During the World War II, he was in a communist resistance network. After World War II, he became the commissaire of Marseille. A couple of men from the Los Angeles Times named Kraslow and Lurie have written a book called The Secret Search for Peace in Vietnam. And I hope that every one of you will buy that book because it's the biggest mess of tripe you ever saw. And the sad part of it is it will not emerge as the tripe that it really is for another 5 years. But then it'll be wonderful to have that book on hand because by that time you're going to find it's disappeared. The British have a fine definition for conservative. They say that a conservative is a man who says, I told you 10 years ago that this was going to happen. And we're conservatives here tonight. Get a hold of that book, The Secret Search for Peace in Vietnam by Kraslow and Lurie of the Los Angeles Times Bureau in Washington. And they tell you about this wonderful man, Obrak, who was a brilliant commissaire for Marseille after the war. Actually, what was happening in Marseille was that the communists got in there first, And they took German collaborators, French who collaborated with the Germans, and if they were willing to work with the communists, why then they gave them cards identifying them as men of the resistance. And if they were anti-communists, why they liquidated them as collaborators. They went in there, and this man, Obrock, real name Samuel, who changed his name to Obrock, whom Kraslau and Lurie were so proud of, was too far to the left even for de Gaulle, so de Gaulle sacked him. Then somehow or other, I don't know how he ever got enough money to come to America, he came over and studied over here for a while. The report is that he studied at Harvard. And I can't imagine that. It's too bad that I wish that we had fallen into the hands of a good mentor like Al Cap. Because if he had, why our chances, the chances of the United States and our boys out in Vietnam might be much better. Well, he didn't. He went back to France. And he got himself a job with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And they sent him down to Rome, where he worked there under an Indian communist, who was his chief. And of course, eventually in 1966, why we see Professor Kissinger being invited to Sopot, Poland by Mr. Cyrus Eaton for a pugwash conference. And there Kissinger was introduced to a Frenchman, a biochemist, associated with the Pasteur Institute, and having close contact with the Pasteur Institute in Phnom Penh and in Hanoi. Now this man Markovich said to Kissinger, I want you to meet my great friend, Mr. Obrock. Here is the authority on Vietnam. He's a great friend of Ho Chi Minh, and he can tell you what America ought to do. My good heavens. Would we go to Goebbels to ask him what we should do in World War II? Why, if anybody had suggested that, why, they would have booted you off the stage. How far this country has gone down the drain in a single generation. Had you talked about not wanting to win the war or hoping that we would lose one generation ago, you would have been in trouble. Last night I was sitting down here in the Hungry Pilgrim with Reverend Hammond, and this insolent busboy asked us what we hoped to accomplish at this meeting. He said, I hope we don't win in Vietnam. And this is the sad state we've come to. Well, to get back to our story, Mr. Markovich brought in his friend Obrock, and Obrock said, why, certainly, I can tell you all about Ho Chi Minh because he lived with me in Paris in 1956. He lived at my home. He is the godfather of my child. And can you imagine it, ladies and gentlemen? On that basis, with that recommendation, we select him as an emissary to Hanoi. So right away, Kissinger comes back, tells the State Department and Johnson about the find that he had found. And then, if you recall, Johnson sent Obrock and Markovich out there, and they came back and said, now this was very early, sent them over there in 1967, sent them over again very early, I believe it was in January. They had another meeting with the Hanoi representatives and came back and told us that if we would declare a bombing halt, why, they would start meaningful negotiations. And of course, you will recall that very early in the January of 1968, we did stop our bombing for a time. And that permitted them to build up their supplies for that Tet Offensive, in which they killed every prisoner that fell into their hands. I'll never forget that Tet Offensive. Poor General Lowen, who had the chief of police in Saigon, got hold of a Viet Cong terrorist leading a group that had killed every prisoner that fell into their hands. And at that time, the situation was so fluid, you didn't know what was going to happen next. Men might swoop out of any alley at any minute. Lowen didn't know what to do with a man. You didn't know what streets were safe. He couldn't take him into a police department, so consequently, he put a gun to his head and shot him. It was the only thing he did because General Lowen was entrusted with the protection, the defense of Saigon. So he shoots this man, photographer took a picture of it, and you saw that on CBS, on every television screen in America. And what a cry of indignation went up from our country because he wasn't given a fair trial. This leader of a bunch of murderers. I told General Law at the time, General, you only made one mistake. You should have shot the photographer. And our country, our press, has the indignation to rise up on its hind legs and starts hooting because Agnew says anything about our press being slanted and our television, our radio being slanted. It's pretty hard to argue with them now about Vietnam because we haven't yet reached the period where we can force them to look at facts and admit that they have been liars to you. So now the only thing we can do is to hold up the Algerian War to them and point out to them what they did then when they literally, our entire press, TV, television, our entire media took on the public relations account of the biggest bunch of cutthroats and murderers in the Middle East. And of course now they're mad at the French for selling airplanes to the Arabs, when as a matter of fact they were for the Arabs when the French were fighting them. And of course one of the things I wanted you to remember, if I don't leave you anything else here tonight, I want to leave this thought with you. Nasser is not the dangerous man in the Middle East. George Habash may turn out to be. He is one of the leaders of the terrorist movements there in Jordan. But standing on the sidelines and the nation that is really going to give us trouble when the thing flares up in the Middle East is Algeria. And today, Mirz al-Kabir, the finest naval base in the entire Mediterranean, is being occupied by the Russians. The port of Bon has been turned into a Russian submarine base. The entire Orez mountain ranges have been turned into missile fields pointed towards Europe. You know why they're pointed towards Europe? Because when Russia delivers an ultimatum to us to get out of the Mediterranean, they are then going to say to France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, West Germany, you ask the Americans to get out of the Mediterranean or else we'll hit you. And if the Americans get out, everything's going to be all right. There won't be any trouble. And that is the pressure that's going to, that is the way things are going to unfold. You watch this thing. So we're going through a repetition of parallel, that sort of thing now in Vietnam. This blackmail to make us do what is unfeasible, you say, on the promise that everything will be all right if we will, and then once we do it, why, they never follow through. Every concession that we have made in return for serious negotiations has come to nothing, and yet they continue to put this over on us. And now, of course, we're in the position we're in. And I'd like to go back and bring up another parallel to you. I remember those days in 1945, right after World War II, when General Philip D. Gallagher was down there in Indochina setting up Ho Chi Minh. How I wish we could bring up before an audience like you people here tonight all of those American colonels, majors, captains who were down there setting Ho Chi Minh up. I knew all of them. There was René de Fourneau, who is now in Indianapolis, going to John Birch meetings, telling Look magazine that Ho Chi Minh said he liked Americans. Can you imagine a man who isn't bright enough to know when he's being conned after all these years of watching Uncle Ho? I love that picture of avuncular, good old avuncular picture of Gentle Ho with a soft voice. The only parallel I can see to him in America right now is Mike Mansfield with his soft voice. And of course, I have just finished a report on Mansfield. Incidentally, I'm awfully sorry that I don't have my May H2B reports with me. They may arrive here tomorrow. My May reports were on Cambodia and all of the things that I thought you folks ought to have for the record, so that you would have something to refer to on Cambodia as this thing unfolded. My June report is on the infiltration of the churches in Europe and what was done about it and what happened to the people who tried to do something about it in Europe. And in writing these reports, why, from time to time, I've gone back to 1945 to this group of officers, Major Buckley, Colonel Halliwell, Rennie DeFourneau, Preston Scheuer, how I wish we could go into every one of these men. They went down there and set Ho Chi Minh up in business. Philip D. Gallagher in February 1946, broadcasting over Ho Chi Minh's radio, calling on the natives of Indochina to come and join Ho Chi Minh because the United States was behind him. They didn't have to worry about not winning. General Liu Han had come in there for the Chinese, and he had set up a political party also, which was anti-communist. As soon as General Liu Han pulled out, why, then Ho Chi Minh raked in all these men who had been working with Liu Han. They buried them in the ground up to their necks and then ran harrows over them. And this was the gentle, kindly voiced Ho Chi Minh that's been sold to you as Uncle Ho by people like Markovich and Obrak. Now, Uncle Ho had a protege in those days whose name was Le Xuan, capital L-E, capital X-U-A-N. And Le Xuan, strange thing, General Philip D. Gallagher came into Indochina, and it didn't surprise him a bit to come into a French colony and find a young Indochinese boy speaking perfect English. It didn't seem strange to him. He didn't ask how this happened. When it wasn't strange. The boy was Ho Chi Minh's protege. He'd been trained for that, to con the Americans. And so General Gallagher took him on as his interpreter. And you know, Gallagher would make a speech, and Le Xuan would translate it. And Gallagher didn't have any more idea what Le Xuan was really saying than I would if he were standing in front of me speaking in Sanskrit. And then Le Xuan would tell Gallagher what the natives were saying and what the dignitaries were saying that he was talking to. And there was no way of checking up on this. And I think of this every day. When I think of our sending Obrak and Markovich on trip after trip to represent us as intermediaries with the enemy, and you realize, here are these men who have been friends of Wilfred Burchett for years. Wilfred Burchett, who has been the most cold-blooded, vicious antagonist of the West ever since the Korean War, who has always worked against us. And they are bragging that they're friends of his. That is on that they stake their claim as authorities in Southeast Asia and their friendship with Ho Chi Minh. You realize that we send them out there as intermediaries, and we haven't a single way in the world in checking up on what they really tell Hanoi or what Hanoi really tells them. And it is therefore logical to assume that these two men have been acting as Kissinger's advisors on one hand and Hanoi's advisors on the other. And that being the case, there isn't a chance in the world that they are slanting their reports in our favor. And this is the position that we're in as our boys are being pulled out of Cambodia today. And we come back to that final statement by Nora Beloff when she said that Mr. Kissinger says that our pullout from Asia must not be made to look like a defeat or a retreat. That eventually Asia is going to go communist, but it must not happen immediately because it must not look like a defeat or a retreat from us. Now, this is the cold-blooded facing of the facts that we have to go through in our conscience here tonight. I don't know how we're going to do what we're going to be able to do to change history at this late date. I would give anything if you folks could get one man here to speak before you, and that man would be General Victor H. Krulak. When I first met Victor Krulak, he was a major in the United States 4th Marines in Shanghai in 1938. Krulak became commander of the 3rd Corps, United States Marines in Vietnam. When it dawned on him that that war could be ended in 2 months by conventional means, that Washington was preventing them from winning the war and was passing over for promotion every man that wanted to win it, why, he immediately retired from the Marine Corps and became president of the Copley News Service in San Diego. And you know, I wish more of you Americans would write letters to the Copley News Service saying that you would like to subscribe to the San Diego Union. I want you to put me on your subscription list. Send me the bill here. I am subscribing to this only because General Victor Krulak is there. Because there, I believe, is the nearest man we have in the United States today to being another General MacArthur. If Krulak were here tonight, he would tell you that what we are doing in Vietnam is disgraceful, that it is going to lead to a greater war. Of course, you all remember that it was Britain's weakness vis-a-vis Germany that brought on World War II, not strength. And this is what we're going to have to face out there. If Krulak were standing here at this microphone, talking to you folks, I think he would say to you, organize. You can't do anything alone. You must apply to political action back here the same rule that we apply to tank warfare. And the first rule of tank warfare is to keep your tanks massed and to keep them mobile. Because if you have one person going off here and one going off there and one going off here, you're not going to get anywhere. And if you send your tanks off, one of them over here and one of them over here, they're going to be picked off one at a time. And anybody who tells you that they're not going to join any conservative and patriotic organization in this country, because they think they can do more working on the outside, you look them right in the eye and say the trouble with you is that you do not want to discipline yourself to keep a given date at a given time and to act with others. The enemy is organized back here. And I wish that I could take you folks, I wish that more of you could come over to Europe. And I wish I could take you for a tour there. You see, my headquarters is over in Europe where I write my HW reports, which is, to the best of my ability, a private intelligence report to the subscriber. And I could take you over there and show you the orders that come into the French student organizations, and then show you that the identical same orders come into student organizations over here. They all come from the same source. And that these orders over there, the orders that the French student organizations have received for the summer are create trouble, make it a hot summer, disorder, riots, general strikes, paralyze social life of the country. This is awfully interesting because what we're going right back to is Trotsky's words when he said, I've always loved this, and this is so applicable to what we're saying today. He said, insurrection is not an art, insurrection is a machine, and the parts of that machine are called riots, demonstrations, general strikes, paralysis of the social life of the country. And after those parts have gone into motion, all that is necessary is a knockout blow to the chin of a paralytic. And that is why these orders are going out to students all over the country. In the brief time that I had to speak to you last night, I told you about the students, the 3 American student representatives that went out to Hanoi and came back with a cry for help, saying, this is our last card. We're backed against the wall. You've got to save us. Stir up trouble in America. Back here in America, the people who sent them out didn't believe them, so they sent a man named Douglas Dowd out there. I had no more idea who Douglas Dowd was than the man on the moon when I got this word of his mission to Hanoi. And he came back with the same message saying, it is up to us to make trouble at home because their back is against the wall, morale is cracking, and we have to do something to save Viet Cong. At the same time, we find them putting out a propaganda magazine just 1 month ago in which the headline was, where is the American left now that we need them? And yet, we find the same people telling this man Dudman, and Dudman writing back here in the press that everything we've done is wrong, and they're winning because we went into Cambodia. And you see, that isn't the case. We are giving them a new lease on life by pulling out. And unfortunately, I'm sure that not many people are going to listen to me when we say that. And that is why I wish we had some way of getting the voice of General Victor Krulak to you people. Remember his name, remember his address, write and get some sample copies of the San Diego Union. Tell Krulak of Copley News Service that you want to read what he is writing, because at last we're getting a clear voice calling on Americans to win, and here isn't a man who calls a patriot a super patriot. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've gone round and round here, and I've taken a lot of your time. You've sat here for a long time. I know that some of you have something that you would like to ask here before we taper this off for the evening. It's been a long day for you. What would you like to talk about this country? Some of you out there, I'm sure, have something that you'd like to bring up. Yes, sir. Well, of course, about that student outburst after we went into Cambodia, I loved that picture in Newsweek magazine of that girl down on her knees screaming in terror over the dead body, the student that had just been shot, you say, and this was used as a tearjerker. And then we find out a few weeks later that the family found out where their daughter was when they saw that picture, because she'd been a bum for the last 6 months and they didn't know where she was. She was drifting, you see. And I'm afraid that Nixon was guilty of understatement. When I was a boy, why, the definition of a bum was a man who didn't care whether school kept or not. He didn't take a bath, didn't bother to get a haircut, he didn't have any principles. And I think Nixon was just about hit it on the head. And I was interested in what a prominent British psychologist wrote in the Daily Telegraph at the time of that Kent shooting. And he said, so why is America making such a fuss? Because 4 students who went someplace where they didn't have any business to go, when they knew there was trouble, there was going to be trouble, happened to get shot. And now the students are demanding all sorts of things just because these 4 students who didn't have any business there in the first place were shot. And if we give in to the students, why, they will immediately make new demands. When the war in Vietnam was over, when we have peace, they'll find something else. This is the indication of the age, and we are approaching this revolution where all of the machine that Trotsky talked about has been set in motion. There's what we're up against. But let's not go on about that. I wonder if somebody has something. Yes, sir. In case you didn't hear this gentleman, he asked me what I thought would happen if our country were to cut off all trade, aid, food, with the communist nations. And I think that it would be an excellent... Speaking of aid, I don't know if you have heard, but I think that the British definition of American foreign aid is excellent. I read it in the Daily Telegraph a short time ago. The Daily Telegraph definition of American foreign aid is money paid by poor people in a rich country to rich people in poor countries. I intend to send that to Tom Anderson. Yes, sir. I can't hear you. General Krulak is Krulak. General Victor H. Krulak, Copley News Service, San Diego, California. And Krulak is a fighter. Krulak says there is no reason on earth why that war should not have been won in 1964. Yes. Yes. I didn't hear what effect on what? I didn't hear the first part. On the continent, the British elections. Actually, a lot of the conservatives all over the continent, patriots, good people, picked up hope with the British elections. But now your European conservative is concerned about one thing, because it appears that the conservatives, now that they're in, are going to take Britain into the common market. And that common market is not an economic union, it's a political union. And the supranational government at the top is strengthening and strengthening. And of course, you see, one of the interesting things about the communists that a lot of people haven't realized is that in many cases they do not want to take over the government of a country. They do not want to take over the country. They want to leave the existing government burdened with the problem of administration. With all these troubles, riots, demonstrations, leave them burdened with the administrations, but with the communists able to dictate the policy. And that's what they have been doing in most of the countries of Western Europe, waiting for this supranational government to package all of Western Europe, and then when you take over the supranational government, you've taken over the rest of the continent. And that is one of the things that alarms us about the next step in England. Am I taking too much time, Larry?
Well, there's no reason why Hilaire can't go down and talk to some more if they want to, but we've got to clear out.
You know, this gentleman here, you call him Larry Bunker. I have always known him as Simon Legree. And he cracks whip over me. And so what we'll do, we'll let him close this, and you and I can have a conversation down here. We can get together and have a talk. It's been a lot of fun talking to you from up here, but it'll be more fun standing down there among you. So let's let Simon Legree close this if he wants to, and then we'll get together.